Hello and welcome to Future Whenua Yarns, having conversations that matter because conversations become matter. I'm Zeb.
And I'm Rob, and what we're going to be doing in this series is effectively carrying on the conversations that were started at Future Whenua Summit. We're going to talk about what Future Whenua Initiative is in a wider context and really why we're doing these things. So this is the sort of the inaugural podcast. We're going to be talking with...
Yeah, we're talking with sort of farmers and growers and technologists, scientists, policymakers, systems thinkers, storytellers, culture shapers. And yeah, that's really been the theme of Future Whenua Summit thus far. So just a bit of context of where we've come from. We're on a farm in southern New Zealand. And yeah, we're into a bunch of innovative projects on a production basis and also technological basis. And it sort of led to this Future Whenua Summit, a 3-day gathering that we held first on our farm and more recently up in the Hawke's Bay on the Mangarawa station. And it's been a really good way to bring people together around this idea. And then we just thought this year that we'd continue the conversation with the series of these yarns throughout the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're excited to get started. We've got some big names coming up. But for this first inaugural episode, we're talking with
James Erlich of Regen Villages, starting with a very big name. Regen Villages is, the Tesla of eco-villages, they call themselves. It's a fitting moniker because they're just taking this idea about how we can live on the land and really applying technology to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I understand correctly, he was on an Obama admin task force, so he's obviously like at the peak of the peak when it comes to, sort of the infrastructure discussions.
And still in there now with the Biden administration. And yeah, so he's got this really interesting background from biodynamic gardening and technology, and then he talks in his presentation about hemp farming and just a heap of topics that we'll be exploring further in this series. So it's a really great one to start with. James just outlays so much of the needs that we're facing right now in a really encompassing presentation.
You would have been absolutely fizzing.
Yeah,
it's got to be a great interview for you, just like getting all into those topics. I mean, you've been thinking about this, 5 years plus, sort of as to how you do this here. And to be talking to people like that, it's, you're getting up there.
It was a pretty good moment for me talking with James, and I was just in awe actually watching, especially at the start when he went through his presentation. I spoke first with James about a year ago because of our intention to build community on the farm, and through that research found really this Regen Village as they're at the pinnacle of this movement. So when we talked about this originally, he said they were looking in New Zealand as a place to implement one of these, and at the time they had funders of up to 100 million for a single project ready to go. So there really is an opportunity here.
Yeah, absolutely. And important note on this one, it's quite a visually intensive episode to start with, so I'd highly recommend jumping on the YouTube channel to watch this one. So if you are listening, definitely hit pause and go find it on our YouTube channel because you don't want to miss the presentation at the start. It's pretty visually compelling, so I wouldn't want to miss that one. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. We're going to jump right into the interview now, so don't forget, subscribe, follow, share, all the usual stuff that everyone says, but we're going to say it too because we need that. And yeah, without further ado, here's the interview between James Ehrlich and Zeb. We'll see you guys next time.
Enjoy. James, fantastic to be connected with you once again. We're here having a conversation about the future of the whenua, the future of land use, and we've sort of narrowed in some agricultural practice and different ways that we can approach farming, and then just as we develop this inquiry into what is our relationship with the land, it's much more than food production practice. It's how we relate to the land. It's how we live on the land. And Regen Villages, your organization, is just right at the precipice of this movement. So awesome to be connected with you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Regen Villages.
Sure. Great to be here and there at the same time. The magic of carbon-less travel on Zoom. I'm happy to share my screen and I guess you can see that now, right?
Yeah, I see a beautiful image of the future is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, well, that's how we envision things, right? So we start with with this concept, and I'll just go through a little bit of a history and a journey that we're on. So I'm James Ehrlich, and I'm founder of Regen Villages, which is a Stanford University spin-off back in 2016, based on my case study research of probably about 15, 16 years of organic, biodynamic family farming and eco villages and intentional communities. I am also an entrepreneur in residence in the Stanford University School of Medicine, in what's called the Flourishing Project. I am a senior fellow at NASA Ames Research Center, and I am a faculty member at Singularity University. And then under Obama and continuing now under Biden-Harris, with a little bit of a break in between for obvious reasons, appointed to a White House OSTP Joint Task Force on Regenerative Infrastructure. So basically, Regen Villages is this idea of a modern interpretation of eco-village living, and that is based on this idea of effective, organic, biodynamic, small plot, but biodiverse planning. I was inspired when I moved out to Northern California from New York to meet these kinds of farmers and to learn about the work of Rudolf Steiner and this idea of celestial planning for planting and cultivation and harvesting. Also by the work of Bill Mollison from Australia in the 1970s on this topic of permaculture and food forests, which are these really nutrient-rich, dense areas of food forests, but that essentially require very little maintenance because they're once established. There's a symbiotic system that's set up there. I am a foodie. We'll just throw that out there. I love delicious, healthy, organic food, and to cook and to be with people who share the same thing in their desire for delicious meals. And I found in my life that these meals really center me and bring me happiness, and everyone around me is also happy. And I think it's just a celebration. And so I found that was a real driving force for me in my life in doing this research because I like to eat delicious things. And through that, I became really aware of this idea of eco-villages and intentional communities that over the years, over the decades, and since probably the 1930s and 40s or something, that these small communities have been cobbling together these technologies that work. They're very, in many ways, low tech, but high efficiency in terms of self-reliance and resiliency at the neighborhood scale. So fast forward, I came to Stanford University after about 15, 16 years of this case study research on the farming and intentional community side. But prior to that, I actually come from a software background. I'm a video game designer and developer. And so I have this kind of software tech thing in my system. So, but I came to Stanford and I got involved in the solar decathlon competition, which is essentially who could build the most energy positive home. And this cohort has been going on now for, I think, about 18 years or 19 years. And they've reached kind of a level of understanding in this ingenuity. So when I came to the cohort in 2012, I was really sort of enamored with this idea of neighborhood scale, regenerative resiliency. And so I'd gone to the professors and I explained to them my feeling, which was that a smart house inside of a dumb neighborhood doesn't make much sense. And fortunately for me, I had the right professors at the right time who agreed with that with tremendous design empathy. We initiated this research, which was Regen Villages. I wanted to go deeper than just the built environment. I was really looking for actually a signaling, if you will, between the natural world and technology. And if we could develop a software relationship with nature. And that's why I was inspired learning about the work of Dr. Suzanne Simard from the University of British Columbia, who had lovingly coined the term of wood wide web versus the world wide web, because she discovered under the forest floor in the Pacific Northwest this inoculation of mycorrhizal bundles, essentially rooted into all of the plants and the trees and the shrubs across pretty vast distances. These are very large organisms that can span somewhere between 250 plus circular kilometers. So they're pretty huge single organisms. But what's amazing is they don't have a single brain, a central brain. They have intelligence, it's sentient, but intelligence at the point of sensing. And that was something really impactful for me to imagine, that this mycorrhizal network is conveying all of these nutrients and minerals and carbons and sugars across this network, a ledger, really, an elegant economic system. And I thought, well, gosh, that's pretty much what I was looking for in order to facilitate software that could imagine the design of these kinds of neighborhoods virtually, but then the implementation, to blueprint, to planning conditions and zoning, and then actually operating, these communities. So at the heart of everything from our perspective, as I mentioned before, is delicious bioavailable food. And that this idea of monoculture, even organic, of single crop, is really not necessarily the best way to feed 10 billion people. In the UN, the UNCTAD did a report on this back in 2013. Headline was "Time to Wake Up." It was like 72-point font. And basically their research shows that the best way to feed humanity, expanding humanity, is actually not big ag, it's actually small ag. It's actually hyper-local, regional, biodiverse, and this patchwork quilt of different kinds of cultivars, non-till soil, so you allow that mycorrhizal network to take hold, use cover crop so that you don't get runoff, right? And no interventions, right? So you have you letting nature handle your pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, issues by enabling the natural symbiosis to be self-healing and take place. From an economic perspective, this is really interesting too, because it's farming for the neighborhood and the extended adjoining communities, as opposed to farming for wholesale and mass distribution to great distances away. And I think that's something really important, is that we have to go back to this local, regional resiliency and safety in our food and our food matrices. So we marry, the soil-based farming with controlled environment farming. It's a really nice balance, we think, especially in environments where it's seasonal and you have winter months, which are cold and dark, and you're obviously not going to be growing the same things, year round. But in these controlled environment greenhouses, we use aquaponic and aeroponic systems, which is essentially an ancient Asian form of farming, where you use a variety of fish protein, which is several different species of freshwater fish, freshwater shrimp, crawfish, etc. And their waste is actually ammonia. And then through a light biological interaction, is converted from nitrites to nitrates. And with a low energy water pump, it brings this nutrient-rich water to the top of these lattices. And then with gravity, it feeds all of the plants what they need. And then the water comes back to the fish tanks completely purified. So it's really circular in that way. And then we attach to these greenhouses, the vermiculture, which would be aquatic worms and black soldier fly larvae. These are lovely little creatures that eat their own weight every day in food and animal waste, but then are the perfect nutritional input for the chickens and the fish and other small animals. So again, you get this complete circularity with this connection to these controlled environments. And the best way to really describe the circularity really is kind of an overview map of regen villages from the perspective of how one system becomes the input of another. So the output of one system really is the input of another. But moreover, that for the first time ever, we can actually understand the relationship between these previously siloed infrastructure pieces. For instance, that the energy system understands a water system, understands a waste system, food and housing and all those pieces, how they fit together and their reliance on each other. So they can learn from each other and improve each other, which is really, really unique. And that's the basis of our Village OS software. The kernel of which is to really look at generative design, which is machine learning, or some people might say a digital twin, and a specific land opportunity, land grant, and then to fully understand how a built environment village can work on that land, impact the housing, but also how we can view the open space from a completely new lens, fully productive, as I showed before. So the first part of the software is to change the rules, is to flip some switches for rezoning agricultural land and ranch land to at least mixed use, residential, light commercial. But where you realize the way our planning works and software works is that 2/3 of those land grants are really still productive. So you're really not compromising at all, either the agricultural or the ranch or open space perspective. And then the second part of the software is once the neighborhood is built and up and running, the Village OS is really the sort of the central mycorrhizal brain, if you will, that looks at the systems and is continuously simulating and improving and optimizing, primarily the flourishing mechanisms for these places. So our goal with Regen Villages is pretty straightforward. It's to replace suburban sprawl that's happening all around the world with a new model that doesn't pave over the farmland. So we have a certain amount of new build or retrofit density for housing, but that the most of the land is really, as I mentioned, for productive use. So here's an example, right? This is a 25 hectare, 60 acre essential open piece of land, maybe fallow, maybe previously organic monoculture or some other kind of ranch land. But the software can understand the geospatial construct of the land itself and then create this map, this overlay of a potential 400 home neighborhood. So you have apartments, townhomes, condominiums, some row houses, single family homes, and a nice mix of some light commercial spaces, clinical health, dental, shared, organic supermarket, other kinds of things that make these communities really vibrant and self-reliant. In other words, they can actually be on their own, interconnected with the wider community, but in case of district scale failures, which we predict not as if, but when, these communities keep humming along, right? But in this example, it's sort of perfect. You get to see that roughly 2/3 of the plan is productive. It's water capture, it's biodiverse, organic, biodynamic farming, it's animal husbandry, it's the controlled environment greenhouses, it's energy generation and storage through microgrid distribution, and of course, waste to resource management. So in these kinds of communities, you don't need a sewer hookup. Ostensibly, we don't need a water hookup. And because of the future of mobility, we also see the very, very light footprint when it comes to traffic implications. These are all big questions municipal governments always want to ask. I like to say it's not Star Trek, it's not a holodeck, okay? These are very real, beautiful communities around the world that focus on nature and human interaction with nature and community coming together. So different socioeconomic level, ethnic, racial, cultural, religious, all those background barriers are really reduced because we share in common our recipes and our stories. And that's where I think food is a great equalizer in that regard. Also, aging in place. So my current affiliation at Stanford University is in the School of Medicine, as I mentioned, in the Stanford Flourishing Project, because my research essentially parallels what are called blue zones, where people are living very long, healthy, happy lives based on where they live and how they live and having access and agency with nature and sustenance. So it's about reimagining open space in balance with nature, with animal husbandry, and understanding that that all these different animals play a role in aerating the soil and fertilizing the soil and being connected to the cultivation of the plants, but also that we can see the vibrancy of the village square with those light commercial services, the piazza kitchens, the long farm to table experiences, the year-round farmers market. So even if you're in a social or affordable flat, living in the center of a village like this, you feel healthy, you feel wealthy in that regard. It's this concept of living where you kind of pour out into the nature and the nature pours back into you with the walkable, bikeable, edible, communities with the central cafe. You can smell the fresh bread being baked in the morning and the coffee, and then you get up early to jog or meet people for breakfast. It's just lovely kinds of experiences. Also that you can, if you want to, be involved in the cultivation or the village management. And it's not an obligation if you so choose to do it. We'll have the sort of task ledger as part of our Village OS. And those tasks that you and your family do can thus reduce your monthly association fees or your rent or even maybe your mortgage. So it's really an eco-village on your own terms. Those people who want to do more, earn more and get those kind of bonus points. Those people who want to do nothing are not scorned. They just pay a higher monthly amount. So this idea of raising children, right, in a village like this is completely germane to it takes a village, because the children are able to run in a car-free community and bike and play and grab something delicious to eat while it's growing and see where their sustenance is coming from and understand their role in the symbiosis of life, right? It's really important stuff. But also that we have these wildlife corridors so that we're using indigenous wisdom and First Nations, Maori, wisdom into these kinds of communities so that you get this pioneer heirloom growth as well, because those creatures, those animals bring goodies with them. And you can only really get that kind of animal wildlife corridors if you really focus on reducing car traffic to almost nothing. So from our perspective, we see where I am right now in Silicon Valley, there's probably no less than about 18 or 20 autonomous vehicle companies. So certainly within the next decade, or maybe sooner, we will see this, what we call level 5 autonomous vehicles. So driverless, no steering wheel, shared electric or hydrogen mobility, basically. And then take that to the next level with these drone deliveries and drone taxis, where all of a sudden, this local overproduction, abundant surplus connects to other of these lily pad overproduction surplus. And you start to get this lovely interchange, local, regional, national, sort of statewide safety and resiliency in supply chains. This is a really, really big topic that has been bubbling for a long time, but now because of COVID, because of certain kinds of issues, geopolitical issues, now the war in Ukraine and Russia, you have real issues all around the world. So just to recap, Regen Villages is all about this idea of safety and resiliency in the built environment, and that these communities foster compassion and empathy and altruism and peacefulness, brokering peaceful places around the world. It's kind of a nice concept. We look at the built environment through this idea of what's happening now, which is a revolution in prefab, modular, and component construction. So essentially, instead of a stick-built house where 30 or 35% goes into a dumpster, literally, in terms of waste, because it's imprecise. Now you have these controlled environment and robotic system warehouses where on assembly line, these wall units and components and even modules of homes are built in a way where 30% of construction waste is taken care of. So that's 1/3 less waste and 1/5 less cost to actually build on site. One of the other things that we're really excited about is this renaissance in 3D extrusion and 3D printing, which we think for the global south is going to be game changing, especially replacing concrete with hemp and hempcrete and bamboo makes very beautiful, durable typologies, which are, fireproof and pest resistant and mold resistant and compostable when you're done with it. But hemp is also pretty incredible because hemp as a plant puts more nitrogen into the soil than it takes out. It's very unique in that way. And they can get somewhere between 6 to 8 harvests per year. So it really is an abundant renewable resource. And it can do lots of different things, not just from hempcrete, but also textiles and resins and oils and food. Hemp is high in protein, high in omega-3. It's one of those planet-saving plants. So an example, the bottom left here, icon house designed by Bjarke Ingels, the famous architect. This house took about 48 hours to print, about a week or so to cure. The finishings went in, and for roughly less than $5,000 US, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house out the door. Very exciting for the global south, as I mentioned. So Regen Villages is focusing on all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we also believe should not be siloed and focused on one or another, but rather we can actually look at the symbiosis of this wheel and really get at the fact that it's this multi-dimensional thing that can be accomplished and solved for. So we're part of the UN Climate Secretariat Resilience Lab. We presented at COP26 in Glasgow last fall. We're part of the EU Network for Rural Development and the EU Commission on Smart Rural Villages. And that's because we're a Dutch holding company. So we have offices in Sweden, in UK, here in the US, in Canada, and most recently opened up one in Santiago in Chile, and hopefully soon in New Zealand, because we have some very interesting opportunities we think make total sense for such a beautiful country, which I was grateful to visit back in 2009 and have been meaning to get back with my family ever since. So there's a lovely brief overview of Regen Villages.
Wow, man. I'm sort of a little shell shock from that. That was absolutely epic. It was. I guess that's not just a housing solution. It's the food systems, it's biodiversity and natural ecosystem restoration, and I think fundamentally it touches on how we need to live as a species, how what is life. And I think we've lost sight of that a little bit in the quest for more and more wealth or whatever it is that we spend our time seeking. And this is like a return to a more natural essence of human nature. So yeah,
it's very interesting because I was really impacted by this Rockefeller Foundation report back in 2012, which, as I was involved with the Solar Decathlon competition at Stanford, which basically said that up until 1950, 75% of all humanity, which was about 2.5 billion people at that time, lived in small self-sustaining communities, just up until 1950. And then their prediction basically was that by 2050, it was going to be flipped, that 75% of 10 billion people would be living in coastal megacities. And I just really felt, wow, this is something that we're not that distant from in our timeline, that we could actually revisit this topic and get to a place where, first with near suburban, but then going further to peri-urban and more rural, locations, that there's a demand, that people would be happy to invest and live in places like this because they feel safe.
It's so the Rockefeller Institute says it's happening 2050 this way, and the trends are like more coastal megacities. What makes you think that?
That was pre-COVID. I should throw the caveat in. That was pre-COVID, because I had predicted before, essentially before COVID happened, that there would be something that would drive people from the cities, something that would make cities less attractive. Now, at first, we were really basing that on the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which were 10 years ago dire. Okay. And not only were they dire, but it was even more chilling, because as you're reading the report, you could see that it's watered down, because they don't do peer review. They do something called consensus. And what does that mean? It means they sneak the report out to big industry. And big industry comes back and says, oh, you don't want to say that. You don't want to do that. You don't want to push that too far. So then they come and they water it down and they water it down. And so we knew even a decade ago that things were really bad and going to get worse. And so essentially, if you're looking at sea level rise and you're looking at storm surges, obviously most of the big cities in the world are close to the water. And so this was our calculation, was that some things were going to start, these anomalies were going to start to happen, that were going to make the cities less attractive. So it wasn't like I predicted COVID, because, I would have been, I don't know what, some kind of genius, I guess. But for sure, we did predict and have been predicting in this kind of climate change anomalies. So now you see, at least over the course of the last 2.5 years or so of COVID, how urban areas have had an exodus, which defied all of the predictions leading up, pre-COVID. And so when I started the research for Regen Villages and started the company back in 2016, there were many people who just thought that I was nuts, because everybody wants to live in a city. Nobody wants to live in the countryside. And I said, yeah, but when things break in a city, they break so badly that you're completely isolated from how to survive, how to protect yourself and have sustenance. So that was our logic in designing this balanced approach to suburban and then further out kind of developments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot out there that risk our cities. I lived in San Francisco for a couple of years after university, and just going to the movies, and whether it's giant lizards or apes or zombie apocalypse or just the San Andreas fault line, and cities everywhere have these risks. And then you'd see this, disaster happen, and everyone's on the highway, traffic jam to get out of the city. Well, where are they going? If we don't have regenerative villages and we don't have enriched rural zones, well, where are they heading to? You can't just live in a tent on a patch of grass. You need food and you need a better shelter. So,
well, this to your point, which is a very adept point, by the way, is that COVID happened and you had cities like New York, London, Paris, wherever, people who could left. And then they went to the countryside. Those, of course, who had country homes, okay, no problem. But other people who just decided to buy a house or to move to the countryside. And the issue is because the countryside has been neglected for so many decades, since the 1950s, right, has been neglected and left behind. These small local governments and with their light infrastructure and everything else, they don't really have the capacity to, as much as they've dreamed all these decades of having investment and an influx of people, they're desperate and they need is to have some amount of infrastructure first. So that's the reason why we come in and we say, look, we can build these communities that are turnkey communities so that somebody comes from the city and they buy in or they rent in or they live in the community, as well as offer it housing solutions to local people who are desperate. There's a huge housing shortage around the world, and especially for people struggling for social and affordable access to housing. So to be able to really provide a solution, those are, by the way, some of the biggest check boxes on the Sustainable Development Goal list, right? Is access to housing, dignified housing, access to clean water, to healthy food, to renewable energy, to curriculum, to health, to women's rights, to indigenous rights. All of those things are baked in when you create a community like this, when you build a place like this.
It's a turnkey solution, you said. What does that look like? Let's say I've got a piece of land near Christchurch, and I think, okay, this is a better way of development. What does that process look like of going from vision and watching this video of your presentation to, okay, we start going?
Well, first and foremost is a willing landowner, probably a farmer who's maybe aging and wants to have legacy for their farmland, doesn't want to just see a suburban sprawl, car culture, American style, European style, whatever neighborhood get built on top of the land, but something quite beautiful and interesting that is a testament to their legacy. As I said, the first is landowner, then is a local government that's ambitious, that really wants to step up and change the rules and say, look, if you're going to build a community that is going to reduce burdens on our municipality, on our region, on our national government, by creating a community that has breakaway functionality in terms of ability to power itself, hydrate itself, digest its own waste on site, have very low car traffic, input, and is a brokering kind of a peaceful, healthy, happy place that reduces burdens on healthcare systems and reduces burdens on police systems and et cetera. That local government steps up and says, this is the kind of future that we all want, right? And that they buck the trend really for fast-tracked permitting and planning conditions. Because if you have the land, and that land is like within Christchurch, basically you can get at least a 15% rate of return. That's a baseline in terms of the business side. And you have an ambitious government that's willing to move things forward and get a full, let's say, few hundred home community built within 5 years, which to us still seems like a long time because we know it can get built much faster. But within 5 years is sort of lightning speed, to be honest, with most government at this point. But those three things answered, we would be able to bring in institutional investment that could get the whole village built, the whole community. So sort of just throw numbers out there, typically in like Northwest Europe, a community of about 400 homes would be somewhere between 85 to 100 million euro. And that's for everything, the full build of infrastructure, the housing, the permaculture design, the whole functioning community for that amount. And so these funds are willing to underwrite the full construction and development of these beautiful neighborhoods if those parameters that I mentioned before are answered. So that's the work that we've got cut out for ourselves. That's what we're focusing on.
Wow. So answer those three parameters, a government, the land, and that could be outside investment of up to, I would imagine that might be 150 million New Zealand dollars. It could come in, and then that would provide these housing, and then potential residents will buy their apartment or buy their tiny home that lives in this area.
It's a combination of purchase, of rent to own, of rent, and some other housing concepts that could be micro mortgage, could be co-housing, co-living, could be a certain amount of sort of like short-term rental, because we really love this idea. Most of the successful eco-villages around the world they're not gated communities. They're actually really more like university campuses. So they invite the sort of ebb and flow of people from around the world who can come in and participate in the community somehow. Maybe they're a professor coming from someplace giving a lecture, or some artist doing something in residence, or music events or cultural events, or whatever it may be. But then it also then draws in the adjoining community into those events. And so there's this wonderful cross-pollination that can happen. So these are not like static subdivisions that people pull into their garages and close the door and go turn on the telly and that's it. We're talking about much more open and active connectivity.
Yeah, looking at the imagery through your presentation there, these are people wearing jeans and a t-shirt. It's not everyone's in a bare feet and tie-dyed skivvies, and so it's like this solution. This is available to anyone, right? It's not just the hippies.
Yeah, I mean, look, I nothing against hippies, because I'm probably one myself, right? And the hippies have been right, all along about everything. People get on hippies, but they're like, oh, clean air. Well, yes, of course. Clean water. Well, yes, of course. I mean, so there's a lot of logic behind that thinking. But the truth is that I approach Regen Villages very much from the perspective of embracing industry and investment, and the right industries and the right investment, but also that the people who've come to Regen Villages, because right now we've got about 50,000 families that are pre-registered to buy or rent homes through our website. These are folks who are, they're either young people, single, young couples wanting to have kids, couples with kids who want to raise their children in this kind of community, the downsizing parents of those kids, what they're called cultural creatives, which would be the grandparents of those kids and the grandkids, who they don't want to buy one home, they want to buy 5 or 10, because they want to surround themselves with the people that they know and they love in these kinds of communities. And this whole idea of senior living or assisted living is so anathema to healthy aging, because the best way to age is being surrounded by babies and nature and animals and other people. You want that sense to always feel like your wisdom is being appreciated and connected to. So as it turns out, that's one of the common denominators in the blue zone communities around the world. Why people are living to such lovely old ages without seeing doctors, without taking pharmaceuticals. It's really because they don't feel discarded. They feel that they're needed and they're connected. So that's really, big part of what we're talking about here. Is it's a very gestalt concept. That's, in other words, it's all inclusive of how people can live in a more logical way and within nature, not separate from it. So it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it is. I guess the only reason I go to that, because there is a bit of a stigma around community living and is it a commune, and because it's so outside of our current awareness, and there was a definite hippie vibe to these movements in the past. I guess, could you give a bit of a rundown just of the history of intentional communities and eco-villages in general?
Well, I mean, going back through history, humanity came together for a variety of reasons. Pre-agricultural, for defending each other and having, a close-knit sort of tribe of people. But as the tribes grew, they would cross-pollinate with other tribes, and there would be that. But then when the agricultural era sort of happened, and people were not nomadic anymore, they were staying put, then you had much more intentionality already in how these communities were formed. But there was this thread of a baby being born, and this sort of Maasai African wisdom that the baby's feet never touches the ground for the first 5 years, because it's being passed around the whole village. The village itself is taking care of this baby until it's able to sort of walk and fend, for itself. So there's a history, if you want to go way back in human history. But then in the modern times, there's something called the Global Eco-Village Network, which was founded originally by a gentleman named Ross Jackson, who currently is Danish and living in Denmark. And Ross was I'd say he's one of the grandfathers, if you will, of the modern eco-village movement, because he was investing in these sort of the development of these communities and supporting these communities around the world. And so a number of these communities, the eco-villages, sprouted up, forgive the pun, but they sprouted up because of some kind of either spiritual movement or because of some kind of rebellion in a sense. And so there's a little bit of a stigma attached to it, like you mentioned the word commune, right? Where people were a little bit nervous that they had to kind of give everything up of themselves to this community in order to live in it. And then going forward from there, over the course of the last 40, 50 years, I'd say, there's been this emergence of eco-villages, which are really based on single families coming together in groups of families and then agreeing that they all have their own separate resources to collectively buy a piece of land and collectively invest in planning and getting the permissions and doing all the hard work. And these communities can take between 8 to 30 years to build 100 homes, because it's just so organically grown in that way. And so when I came to this concept of regen villages, I thought, well, gosh, how do we leapfrog that? Because now we see that with prefab and 3D printed homes and all these different proven kinds of typologies, that realistically, a 400 home neighborhood, completely realistically now, could get finished, built, probably within 18 months. Okay, if all of the stars lined up, right? Like, in other words, you had local government that said, I don't care what you do here, just do it. The neighbors were saying, love you, thumbs up, you got it. The money was there, everything. I'm just saying, technically speaking, right? Nuts and bolts, it's probably 18 months. It's about 6 to 9 months of the land moving and permaculture and setting, where the infrastructure is going to go, and then probably 6 or 7 months after that of other kinds of housing construction, and then a few months of obviously tweaking, right? So it's that was my interpretation, that we could actually go faster and attract big finance, sovereign wealth, pension funds, and the big industrial players who are building these prefab homes with good materials, and then all the system companies, of course, who are always excited about more than one home at a time, right? So, so that's really been our focus, is to take the lovely, rich history of going back to the Rockefeller report, to humanity living in small, self-sustaining communities, then the interconnection to the eco-village movement. But now, how do we take that to the next level? How do we get this to a situation where we can use the Village OS software to change the rules, to leverage these virtual environments at first to reduce the rhetoric, so that the landowners and the developers and the government and the local community, the neighbors, all get into sync, because they feel like they've got their thumbprint, or their voice has been heard. And by doing that, and by using machine learning to do that, we save hundreds of thousands or even millions of euros. Because just for your reference, a typical master plan of a neighborhood like what we're talking about, just for the engineering and architectural work, is probably about 2 million euro, right? And the chance is there's a high likelihood of that plan being thrown back. So then you have to iterate again, which is another amount of money and another amount of money, and et cetera. So there's a high bar to this. So if we can actually do that for like almost pennies on the dollar or pennies on the euro, right? To do the planning part and reduce the rhetoric and get the zoning conditions and the planning conditions, just by doing that, you open up the floodgate for funding and for viability. Because that's what a lot of these big developers do. They buy land, they land bank it, they sit on it. They're very patient because they have a lot of money. They wait for a pain point with the local government sufficient to get the rules changed. And then they once the rules are changed, they're able to fund the full development. So we envision software being able to help change those rules. But then going forward, we have a long way to go on this planet to fix things. So to be able to use machine learning and this continuous digital twin that's continuously looking at neighborhood infrastructure and modeling it and saying, how can we improve the water flow here? How can we improve the energy efficiency here? Oh, there seems to be, something out of range with one of these pumps, and just little pieces of information here or there save money, because then you can understand, well, maybe there's a malfunction with a certain water pump, for instance, by way of example. And maybe you kind of redirect the water around it for a certain period of time, and there's a human intervention to go check the pump and either replace it, it's under warranty or whatever. Or maybe, going forward, ideally, there are robotic interventions. So it becomes very much like a Bill Mollison food forest or permaculture, where it becomes self-healing. I think that's terribly exciting. From our perspective, that's the best use of robots and machine learning, is how to improve human and planetary flourishing. Full stop.
It's amazing. Awesome vision. And I really like this quote behind you there, the Tesla of eco-villages, that just rings so true. If the organic model can take, decades to sort of develop and it all happen, and you're coming in and saying, we have a huge challenge ahead of us, we need to act swiftly and we need to be very efficient and take the tools that we have available to us to make it happen. And of course, the very ambitious timeline, 5 years. I think that's possible. And just kudos for holding that vision and that possibility. Is there examples, just going back to the local government, because I know here in New Zealand we've got the Resource Management Act, and that's predominantly set up. If I was to say I'm going to build a village on our farm, they would laugh me out the door. But if we tell this story and if we provide this example, and I one of the reasons this Management Act is set up is to prevent harm and loss of food producing zonage, but your model uses 1/3 for housing, and then the rest would actually become more productive.
That's correct.
So there's a bit in there to unpack, but apparently, is there an example that local government could follow of how to change the rules?
Well, that's, look, the problem is, to be perfectly honest, I like to say that a lot of the rules on the books were put on there by old white guys with long white beards and top hats, okay? Because these are the people who control district scale services, power, water, waste, transit, big ag, all the different interventions and pieces that go into ranching and big farming and all of that. There's a lot of industrial players who this doesn't fit their business model, what we're talking about. And because they carry a lot of weight and a lot of water, they're the ones who still push these very same rules out into the world. But it's a terrible shame, and we need to fix it. We believe wholeheartedly that a combination of stars lining up will do that. One is that sovereign wealth and pension funds now must, sort of by decree, invest in ESG, SDG, and green transition commitment projects and developments that aren't greenwashing. They actually have to have those KPIs. They have to have those metrics, right? So that's big money, number one. Then you've got all these industrial players who are building on assembly line these housing units and wall units and components, and they have a need to put their housing typologies someplace. Okay, so that's another facet to that supply chain, to that pipeline. Then you've got the other companies involved, whether they're PV companies or wind turbine or water pump or appliances, whatever it may be, where 300-400 home plus community is a meaningful business opportunity for them. It's meaningful. So there's some, in other words, you get a little more weight to the argument to start to shift the rules and regulations. And then overall, you have, especially in New Zealand and other parts of the world, national government that likes to say and speak about progress in this category of addressing housing crisis while also addressing sustainable development goals. And the best way to do that is to create opportunity zones. So the way to really look at addressing local government is to say, look, here's an opportunity zone where this particular piece of land or a grouping of pieces of land are going to be used for this purpose. We're going to build 400 homes, let's say, as an example, but 2/3 of the land grant will be biodiverse, productive, that will support the wider community. Not just the 400 homes, but the wider community can also partake in that abundant surplus. Whereas you know as well as I do, most of the food being produced in New Zealand is not staying in New Zealand. Okay? It's going on airplanes. It's going on ships. It's not feeding people. And unfortunately, as you also probably aware, most of the ag in New Zealand is intended to feed animals who are then exported as well. So that ag is also not feeding people a biodiverse, self-reliant menu. So the question local government and regional government, and yes, national government, have to start answering is what happens when, not if, when New Zealand is cut off somehow from the rest of the world. Just like European countries now have to really understand, what does it mean to be cut off from Russian oil and gas, or Chinese container ships that used to sail back and forth easily? I mean, what does it mean to have sovereignty and safety? And so it's a much bigger story to tell in that way. So that's the reason why we say, okay, here's an opportunity zone. And essentially what we're saying is, build this kind of community. We're not asking that the government just do it for us. If there are other developers out there who want to start building like this and doing just like what we're talking about, great. Then those other opportunity zones should be extended to those folks too. But you have to look 50 years from now, which government doesn't ever do. It never does. It doesn't think, what will this place look like 50 years from now? It really thinks about election cycles and funding cycles, which are typically between 2 to 4 years, sometimes 6 years, or maybe 8 on the outside. So it's very short-term logic and short-term thinking. And we need to fix that. And I think the best way to fix it is to say, look, there's big money that wants to invest, that wants to build these kinds of communities and prove the impact for their investors, while also generating a reasonable rate of return. These communities will turn around and employ some number of people. There will also be, we hope, opportunities, especially in New Zealand, for new kinds of industrial construction using earthen building materials. By way of example, how much New Zealand timber leaves New Zealand for China and comes back as board? That's unbelievably expensive for the average constructor to then build with in New Zealand. There's a huge disconnect. It makes no sense. Why not set up a prefab plant, mass timber, cross-laminated timber at, maybe points north on North Island? You could do other kinds of hemp or bamboo, but basically set up these industries where you're employing people, you're building housing and providing the infill that you need. And again, you're creating self-sufficiency. So that's what happens when you change rules and you create opportunity zones. That's the whole point of an opportunity zone, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like what you're saying, that the trend towards, coastal megacities, the trend is towards globalization. Mm-hmm. And even though the signals are getting faster and brighter, that we need to redirect at least a portion of that focus towards localized economies and decentralization, it's like this long-term thinking is given lip service to. We adopting the 7 generational mindset, or But then when it comes to the actions or the policies, it's back to this myopic, we need cash in the next few years. We need to produce as much food to feed whoever or whichever story is guiding all of that. And it's just like how much brighter and how much faster these signals need to come before we do start adopting some of this systemic societal change towards what you've been talking about.
Yeah, well, again, it's the problem is a lot of people feel that these rules and regulations somehow or another were handed down from God himself. Like somehow they were like tablets from Mount Sinai. And I mean, it's not the case. These are all, man-made constructs. When you look around the world that we live in, everything has been manufactured by men, by people. And we forget that. We just assume somehow that that it's impossible, in other words, to change things. And the reason why I use Tesla as a moniker, it's not that I'm not, an Elon fanboy, because of course I am. But the reason why I use it, that brand, within our own brand, is because beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, as a matter of fact, electric vehicles were ubiquitous in big cities, like New York, for instance. There was a whole fleet of electric taxi cabs. My dad, rest in peace, he remembers growing up, that there was electric ice trucks, delivering ice, which is not a light load, and electric coal trucks, etc. And so the point is that the electric drivetrain it's always been the most efficient, and that there's been all kinds of progress in batteries and storage and generation and things like that, and it got killed, it got absconded and converted into this understanding that the only way to power things is with burning stuff, with burning, oil and gas and coal. And so, the reason why I'm just enamored with that is because of the fact that this one person came along and created a new model that made the old one almost obsolete, which is a Bucky Fuller line, by the way. Buckminster Fuller was known to say that. So that's what was so inspiring to me, was the fact that seemingly overnight, over the last, half a decade or something or more, that Tesla at first was a joke to all the car companies, but then he ate all their lunch and set about a new trend for more efficient drivetrains. So we see the same thing for neighborhood infrastructure and for farm to table community development. And we should be, and any kind of municipality that has agricultural land should be leaning into what we're talking about here, because they need more tax base. They need more intelligent kind of workers and economic incentives. Like, these people coming to live in Regen Villages are also going to be entrepreneurs and creating businesses and hiring people, and probably knowledge businesses and digital businesses and economies. So there's a lot of interest and opportunity to do this, and especially that most importantly, that we're good neighbors, that we want to hire local organic farmers and families who can also then live in our communities and have social affordable access while making living wages, right? That we really want to complement the community and be part of the cultural, aesthetic, and the First Nations wisdom and all of that. so that we really are doing everything we can to be more than a subdivision or a neighborhood, but really, a village. And a village has a different distinctive flavor to it than just a subdivision built.
Part of what I was picking up in there with the comparison to Tesla again was not only did Elon come and create essentially a electric car market, that existed, but he created a market for it. And now all of the big players, there's not one of them that's not working on electric technology. And so I'm wondering if we show some of these examples of a regen village, a turnkey by your organization, then do some of the other developers start picking up on this and thinking, we need to incorporate at least some of the governments or at least some of the, ecological connection or tie-in with it all.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And really what it comes down to is a certain sex appeal. When you make a beautiful community with just very beautiful aesthetic, passive home architecture, but then you have this wider, walkable, bikeable, edible neighborhood that's bursting with flavors, in the season, and it has the ponds for canoeing and kayaking, and maybe in the winter it's ice skating, whatever it is. But that you have just this core community that is an anchor to a place, and that then is really inspiring, because it's also to your point, it's about captivating the other developers, because when they see that there is a huge market opportunity in this for building the right way, in balance with nature and not separate from it, then they can start to change their perspective. And we really believe that the Village OS software will play that role in both helping those developers, because not just for us to use, we plan on licensing the software to other developers as well, right? That they can use the software, but also by using the software and designing the communities in this way, that they gain that opportunity zone status, and further, that they can then get connected to those financial resources that we would be happy then to see how those communities can get funded. I am not in this business to be a greedy real estate developer. I often say that I am a sheep in wolves' clothing when it comes to real estate development. And what I mean by that is that I'm really interested in seeing as many people on Earth have dignified housing with access and agency to their natural resources in these restorative, beautiful neighborhood settings that improve the lives of everybody within a wide kind of radial distance from these village builds. And that, to me, it would be personal wealth, like knowing that people have like secure place to live, and that their kids and their grandkids are growing up healthy and strong. That's a really awesome, moniker for wealth from my perspective.
Mm.
Now, I understand a lot of real estate developers don't think that way. In fact, most, if not all, probably do not think that way. And they would look at a 60-acre, 25-hectare piece of land to build, every square meter of it with houses and commercial space and retail space and parking and all of that, because their business model is to maximize as much profit as they possibly can. But the whole world now has to pivot from extractive, consumptive profit to moderated profit which is based on a new spreadsheet of wealth, which is, in how many years does it take to this community to be completely self-sufficient, and how many years is this community overproducing abundant surplus, and how many years, do you see the longevity increased and the peacefulness of the areas increased. We did this study last spring with Duke University on what life would look like 50 years later after building the Regen Village, people moving in. And it was really interesting, this whole idea of modeling the return on investment. It's a different kind of ROI. It's based on these 20, 30, 50 plus year metrics. Nobody thinks like that. Nobody. Everybody's thinking the same thing. If I put $1 in tomorrow, I want my $10 within 18 months or 2 years. So we have to change. We all have to change our thinking. It's not hard, not easy.
There's a lot of both figurative and literal old men and top hats in the development game, and fortunately there is a changing of the story, and with that will come through the changing of how we make decisions and how we take actions. So your operating system, the Village OS, is that accessible now for a developer could they incorporate parts of that? And another one is, is there a way that an existing development, a new neighborhood or subsection could use the software for their governance or planning how to enhance the ecosystem of their already built environment?
So to answer your question, the first is we're still developing the software. We've made a lot of great progress in terms of architecting the data model, and now we're in the process of ingesting real world built environment and GIS data. So like, okay, here's our first kind of like virtual model. So we're working on that now. And so it's not ready, for prime time in this moment for licensing. We're also currently raising our Series A round, which will go to finish the Village OS software and work on one or two of our pipeline development projects. So our hope is probably all things, to close my eyes and throw a dart, in a dark room, I would say probably within maybe 12 months or so, we will have a licensable, we'll have an MVP on the operational side of our software, which will then be the test bed to show to other development companies how it works, how the design works, and how the operation works for the software. And then probably somewhere, maybe a few months after that, we'd be able to start licensing because we want to first test it on our own village or villages and make sure that it's doing the things that we know it can do and want it to do. So then we'll have the ability to make that happen. And then to answer your question about retrofits, which is a really big question that we get, yes, we're interested in retrofits. And at the same time, we look at starting at least the first projects and the first licensable version of the software to really be around greenfield, new build developments, because there's so much variability in wanting to be able to control and actuate and have interventions with systems, right? And so let's say, for instance, you're looking at some village in Europe that's from the 13th century or something. Yes, it's there and it's a village and it's in disrepair. But by the time you end up retrofitting that ancient infrastructure, you've probably quadrupled the amount of money you really need to spend. So we look at, and also your new systems won't really interface with ancient systems. So everything has to be new in any case to be able to really fully understand it and actuate it. I think the goal for us really is to be able to analyze at least those places, the newer built, not the previous centuries built, and have probably what are called effective overlays. And I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a mid-rise building on the outskirts of a city. The goal would be that our Village OS could look at that building and say, okay, this is what we think the overlays could be to improve the energy efficiency, the water efficiency, have rooftop garden, greenhouses, biophilic edible walls and balcony systems, and if there's any open space next to the building, place for water capture and waste digestion and other small animal protein, chicken coops, etc. And that building may not be able to be fully breakaway and self-reliant, but it can be supplemented, right? Now, that becomes very interesting when you look at a city block where you might be able to supplement, half a dozen buildings. Then all of a sudden you can start to get to some resiliency in an urban capacity in an existing build area. So we look at the software being able to come back and do that later. But to start with, we're looking at new build for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, it sounds like, you're taking on a lot. I'm sure if this story, what you're trying to do, the vision, the dream becomes, there's smart people out there that could repurpose and, have their own innovations around that. You mentioned Buckminster Fuller and I know he's an inspiration of yours. He's well known for the creating a new model quote. There's another, which I'd probably butcher, but something along the lines of, we need to shoot for a future that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time without the disadvantage of nature or anyone. And I absolutely think that is what you're working towards. It's really evident. And on a wee tangent, I just wonder if you could, what your views on Buckminster Fuller's life work was. What's Bucky's vision?
Oh, I love Bucky because he's a classic generalist. He was not an architect per se, or an engineer per se, or a philosopher, or an artist or poet, but he was all of those things, right? He wasn't siloed. He was able to draw from a variety of skills to be able to imagine things. I've spent quite a bit of time sort of studying his life and his work and his imagination, really, which is something that Einstein was also always keen on saying, that knowledge is far less important than imagination, right? So Bucky really represents that for me to this day, and so many examples of the way he thought about designing homes, about how he designed a car, which was also a threat to the automotive industry, because his car, back in 1928 could seat 11 people. It got, I think, something like 32 miles to the gallon, which was unheard of back then. And it was 3 wheels, 2 in the front, 1 in the back, Dymaxion, could turn on a dime and could park, laterally. He had this sort of vision, the teardrop shape that eventually, you could like pull in and add wings to it somehow. It was a little bit over the top with that kind of concept, but they literally ran him off the road. That car ran off the road suspiciously, and some of the investors died. And so that ended the Dymaxion. But, he was vindicated, by the hippies actually in the 60s, because he was a person who thought about resource-driven ecosystems. He designed a map of the world based on natural resource, not on arbitrary and capricious lines defining states, which would make no sense at all. But he designed a map of the world based on flow of natural resources. And Bucky always said, and he, just like you said, he believed that it was more than possible to feed and house and clothe and hydrate and empower and support 10 billion people on spaceship Earth. That was his quote. And so, yeah, I huge fan of Bucky and his work, and I'm a generalist too. I come from a video game design background, and before that, in my teens and early 20s, I was doing lighting for rock and roll bands, and way back when, it was a wonderful time to piss my parents off, I guess, and be on the road with famous, crazy musicians. And then, to spend so much time exploring and being on a journey and just learning about farming and permaculture and biodynamics and other great leaders in the world. It's been a journey for me, and the journey continues. Regen Villages is an amazing endeavor for me because I wake up in the morning and I could be having obviously conversations with Europe, and of course over the day I'm having conversations with Asia and in Africa and Middle East and New Zealand and Vietnam, and I mean, it's like I have all of these different things happening all at once that people are interested and want to see this kind of development happen. So, yeah, I've made some amazing friends over the years, just visiting countries and being with people and breaking bread and the opportunity to lecture both in the university and academic level, but also presentations and et cetera that I've made to the UN and other places. And the truth is there's many more of us in the world than the few who control everything. And that's the really this crazy irony that we live in, because all we're asking those folks is we don't want to take your stack away. We're not looking to take your wealth away. What we're asking is, share some of that wealth so that we can build these kinds of places that we know people want to live in. There is a business model for this. I'm not a communist or Marxist or whatever. I'm a compassionist. I mean, I believe in the right kind of capitalism, and it has to change. We have, like I said before, we need a new model of capitalism that works for people and planet. That's all.
Compassionism, that's a model that I could get behind for sure. And yeah, just what you're saying about being a generalist, I think that has a big layover with just the way our culture is. We're not generalists. We'll do coastal mega cities or big apartment complex or a huge housing development, and then everyone from there will drive over to the industrial zone to do their work, and then they'll order food that's come from over there in big monoculture systems, and yet there's an efficiency in that, but it's fragile. And something like what you've got in Regen Villages is we're living together, we're growing our food here, a lot of us are working on the land together. And so being a generalist with your thoughts, or Bucky, being able to, maybe if he had focused all his time on the dialectic, then there would have different sorts of cars on the road. But instead he sparked 1,000 fires, and his legacy lives on, and design is forever, I'd imagine. And so that same richness, if we bring our systems together and we live where we eat and where we play and where we work, then there's going to be a certain richness that comes into our lives. And what comes out of a regen village like that is I think going to be, something of another level, this 1 + 1 = 11.
Yeah, look, let me just say, there's no such thing as utopia, right? Whether it comes to social interaction between people. I mean, there's some people, you move into a neighborhood with 400 families, a couple thousand people, 2,500 people, who knows, whatever number of people it might be. Maybe some people that you absolutely love, you become best of friends. Some people are okay, you're acquaintance with them. Other people, they're kind of cold, they're sort of off-putting. Other people may not like it all, right? There's no guarantee that everyone is going to get along, because it's not human nature for everybody to get along or all the time, right? And also people have a chance to evolve. So maybe that person who was kind of cold and off-putting at first, warms up and becomes the best of friend. Or maybe the best of friend, something happens and they ghost you. I mean, in other words, there's all this chaos theory that happens. All we're interested really is to create the circumstances for the base of Maslow hierarchical needs, right? Which is you're living in dignified housing, you have access to your natural resource flows, and you feel safe and your family is safe. When those things happen, generally, not all the time, but generally, people are happier and they are more generous and more compassionate, because they're not constantly stressed out of how to survive or what happens if or when something happens. So that, I think, is the right way to imagine and approach this. And yeah, I mean, other than that, I just feel that we're really, really close. That once we can build the first number of villages, even the first village itself, and get that finished, that it becomes a global example of what's possible. And then, then all of the real estate developers and planners and consultants, everybody has to, just like with Elon, everybody has to all of a sudden rush to gain this knowledge and to like get to a place where they can also build these communities, because that's what the demand is asking for. So Elon created the demand for a better electric vehicle. And by doing so, he completely denuded the fear that your battery would run out while driving a car. That was something that everybody was afraid of previously to Tesla. But when Tesla came out, all of a sudden, like, nobody had that thought process anymore. So, yeah, I mean, I think we bake in enough of these very stable concepts, and people then feel that this is the only way they could possibly imagine living. And that sets a competitive marker. And then the other developers just have to do this. So that's the hope anyway. And then I would sit back in my whatever Regen Villages, community that myself and my family are living in, or traveling to, and watch, these beautiful communities blossom around the world. It's a really hopeful, optimistic future.
It
and especially
is.
When cities break, like, we don't want to say Auckland could break or Christchurch could break, right? But when they do, for other reasons, climate anomaly, whatever it is, that there are these lily pads of self-reliant communities that are capable of absorbing, capable of bringing those people in and taking care of them, nurturing them, or building new ones. We have the knowledge then to do it. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of the rural areas. As you know, I think that the strength of our species actually lies in the rural areas, that our future is in the peri-urban and the rural, that if we get this right, that these places become really like havens and little slices of paradise.
Yeah, it sounds like a slice of paradise, and when I envision that, it does give me a feeling of hope, not just a concept of hope. I fluctuate between what motivates me in this work with Future Whenua, between fear of what some of these signals are showing up, and what might happen, with climate anomaly or societal collapse, or even just a big earthquake going on, and knowing how unprepared I am now for that moment. But I try to spend less and less of my time in that place, and more in a place of envisioning and working towards the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. And a solution like Regen Villages is just such a all-encompassing solution, and it really touches on both of those places where my action stems from. And so I do want to be conscious of your time, and
sure.
Just a true acknowledgement of your work, your life's work, and also your work with Regen Villages. So thank you, James, for just shining a light on paving a path for hopefully people in the next few years to adopt this. I would really love to see an example of this be established in New Zealand, and I'd like to visit them globally once you're up and running.
Yeah. Thank you. Me too, and really appreciate your kind support and enthusiasm, and I feel the same way. I'd love to see these blossom and pop up in New Zealand. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people, and it only makes sense for Regen Villages to be realized in New Zealand as an example for lots of other places around the world. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and stay healthy and optimistic, and hopefully we can meet in person one of these days soon.
I hope so. It's been good talking with you again, James. Go keep it.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.